Hello everyone, welcome to the 2022 Annual General Meeting of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. My name is Anita Roper. I'm the Chair of the Board of Directors of ASI and I'll be chairing the AGM today. Thank you for joining us for the 7th Annual General Meeting as an incorporated entity. We have a quorum of members present and accordingly I declare the meeting open. Next slide please. ASI acknowledges Indigenous peoples and their connections to the traditional lands where our members and we operate. We aim to respect cultural heritage, customs and beliefs of all Indigenous peoples, and we pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners in Melbourne, Australia, where I am currently located. Next slide. Just like to remind all attendees that ASI is committed to complying with all relevant antitrust competition laws and regulations. And you can see our policy here on the screen. Compliance is a condition of continued ASI participation. Next slide. You have told us in our member surveys that you value the interaction and opportunity to engage with other members in the Secretariat. We've listened to that feedback and taken it on board in the design of this agenda and made it interactive. So let's have a look at the session today. We have 90 minutes together. So I'll start with a little report on the CEO, from the CEO, or as the chair, sorry, as I should say, as the chair's activities. And then we'll have a report from our CEO, Dr. Fiona Solomon. We'll then move into a panel with our board of directors, where you'll be able to ask questions or comment on items of business that have been tabled in the meeting notice. And then we'll have a session with the new 2022 ASI standards with Chris Bayliss, our Director of Standards. Now, if you represent a member and you have any questions, please use the Q&A box in Zoom. We do also have some IT support on the call, so if you do need any help during the session, please again use the Q&A box on Zoom. It was 12 months ago at the AGM that I talked about the challenging year it had been for an organisation where dialogue and engagement was at the heart of everything that we do. And we've still had the difficulties of 2 years of COVID. And more recently, global uncertainty. Unfortunately, as a result of these events, we're still meeting via Zoom. However, throughout this period, we have stayed focused on our purpose and our goals. And I hope you'll see that from today's session, the significant progress that we've made as an organisation. Next slide. ASI has grown on multiple dimensions. We've achieved some amazing results. Our membership has grown by 39%, with ASI membership now exceeding 200 members. Despite the economic circumstances, we've not only maintained our membership, we've expanded it. Certifications grew from 61 to 165, with almost 1,700 registered elemental users. And what this means is we're extending our reach and increasing knowledge of the sector. All of this has occurred in a period of global economic uncertainty, and it's signs of our further strengthening our organisation's resilience. But these results didn't happen overnight. They are the results of the foundations put in place over the last 7 years and demonstrate how ASI has matured as an organisation. Next slide, please. The board has been given the responsibility of stewarding ASI on behalf of the membership. We are very fortunate at ASI to have such a talented and professional staff, capably led by our CEO, Fiona, which makes the board's job of fulfilling its mandate just so much easier. So let me just briefly touch on some of the highlights. When we think about the year's highlights, whether we think of it from a governance or an operational or a performance perspective, the first thing that comes to mind is the standards revision. Now, both Fiona and Chris will talk about that later. One of the roles of the board is to ensure appropriate strategies and policies are in place. During the year, the board reviewed and updated a range of policies, including we updated the ASI complaints mechanism, we adopted a new human rights policy applicable to ASI's own activities, and we updated the ASI's health and safety policy with new sections on stress and pandemic safe behaviour and safe travel, just to name a few. Ensuring our policies are relevant for a modern organisation is a focus for this board. And during the year, we updated the governance handbook and we reviewed the responsibilities of the board committees to take account of the maturing nature of ASI as an organisation. The audit committee expanded its remit to include risk and undertook a major update of the risk assessment process. The governance committee expanded its remit to address key people performance and culture strategies and policies to reflect growth in the team. One of the features of the governance of ASI is the inclusion of all stakeholders in the governance processes. During the year, the board met with representatives from IPAF, the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, and the board is planning to continue this dialogue when the board meets in October. Central to the board's focus and work is strategy, being clear on our vision, purpose and direction. Next slide, please. During 2021, the board worked closely with the CEO to map out what we need to do to meet the challenges facing the aluminium value chain to position us for the future. We undertook a deep dive and identified the horizon challenges we will be facing as a sector. The result is our 2030 strategy setting out our sustainability priorities. ASI is not a big organisation. We have limited resources, limited people, so we had to prioritise and focus our efforts where we can make a difference. And you can see our 4 sustainability priorities on that slide around climate, circularity, nature positive and human rights. Our 4 strategic pillars across the bottom focus our priorities and activities. We've set short-term priorities for the following year, 2022 and 23, in each of these areas, and Fiona will speak to that later. This is an ambitious program of work that the board and CEO have put in place, and there will definitely be challenges in executing the strategy. But thanks to the foundational work that has occurred over the past 7 years, ASI is now well positioned to be ambitious and set a course of action to drive change in a meaningful way. We are mature enough now to take that longer-term view of the transformational change required. However, we can't do it alone. Essential to its successful execution will be developing partnerships with all those involved in our sector, and we've already started, as you'll hear from Fiona shortly. I'm confident with the capable team that we have in place and the strong position we're in, we'll be able to shape that debate and contribute to the solutions. Next slide. Let me turn briefly to the financial statements and directors' report. These, together with the independent auditor's report, were emailed to all members prior to the meeting. According to Australian law, it is not necessary for members to vote on these statements. They were circulated in advance of the meeting and everybody has had an opportunity and can raise any questions at this AGM if they have them. This slide reproduces the statement of profit or loss circulated in the financial statements for 2021. During the last few years, ASI has accumulated a strong surplus. As a result of this surplus, we've maintained membership fees at the current level, and the board has made a conscious decision to invest some of the surplus to grow the team to match the growth in membership and activities. Next slide. A key financial ratio for ASI is operating reserves to expenditure, which started at low levels and has steadily grown over time. In 2022, the board has set a minimum level of cash operating revenue at 33% of annual expenditure. This would cover about 4 months of average expenditure. With several years of operating surplus and a continuing strong cash position, ASI has achieved a good level of financial resilience. And this supports implementation of ASI strategy, despite ongoing economic uncertainty globally. Next slide. This slide is a snapshot of how our funds are being utilised. On the left-hand side is a high-level picture of how we've invested the surplus funds. We've grown the team to build capability and accommodate the increase in demand for our services. I've already spoken about IPAF and human rights as one of our sustainability priorities. We have a range of projects and collaborations that you are hearing about today. And we've put in place protection for ASI's core assets and also increased our financial reserves. On the right-hand side is our budget priorities for 2022-23. Our 4 sustainability priorities that I've already mentioned, the standards revision and rollout that Chris will talk about shortly, and data and research activities, one of our new strategic pillars. It's essential for us to continue to be evidence-based, to be able to identify trends and to be able to measure the progress that we're making. And of course, engagement and alignment is absolutely essential to how we work. We're always looking for ways to increase our engagement, both within our membership base, but also with those organisations and groups who interact with our sector. Before I hand over to our CEO to give her report, let me conclude with a few thanks and acknowledgements. Next slide, please. Firstly, our directors for their commitment to ASI. They give up their time attending board meetings and participating in board committees. I particularly want to acknowledge the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, Sasha, and also committee member Jan for their diligence in ensuring financial oversight. I want to acknowledge the elected directors for 2022, Jan, who's been re-elected, and our new directors, Rosa and Gerald. They're joining continuing directors, Pippa, Jerome and Alexi, and independent directors, Sasha and myself. My sincere thanks to our 2 retiring directors, Nick and Marcel, for their significant contributions to the work of ASI. Both are committed to the goals of ASI, and I hope will continue to be part of our organisation for the coming years. I also want to thank those directors who've gone before us, in particular Daniel Weston, our immediate past chair. Next slide. I'd like to also acknowledge the incoming Standards Committee for 2022 and my thanks to the outgoing committee members, some of whom have served for 3 consecutive terms during a very busy period. Catherine, Rosa, Jostine, Stefan and Eustace. Anne-Marie has also served 3 terms, but has been appointed by the board for an additional 1 year to fill a vacancy for civil society members. The Standards Committee have stewarded a major revision process culminating in the successful launch of the 2022 standards last month. And my congratulations and absolute sincere thanks for all the hard work of these committee members on behalf of the entire ASI membership. On your behalf, I would also like to thank the ASI Secretariat. And my goodness, what a job they've done in ensuring ASI continues to offer its high level of service during the past 2.5 challenging years. Whilst we have not been able to meet, they have found new ways of working, of connecting with members and of ensuring we have a point of contact. And of course, our CEO, the glue that keeps us together, a true professional in all aspects. And finally, I want to thank you, our members. Whether you've contributed to the standards revision, our working groups, or just contacted us informally with your ideas, a very big thank you for your participation. And with that, I present my report and with great pleasure hand over to Fiona. And just remind you, if you have any questions or comments on the report or have any questions for the AGM, please use the chat box. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Anita, and a warm hello to everyone from me as well. So next slide, thanks, Sad. So Anita introduced our 2022 strategy, and I just want to share a little bit more insight into some of our activities and progress under this. As we know, sustainability can feel big, and we've distilled these 4 headline priorities: climate, circularity, nature positive, and human rights. And these, as we know, are issues that are interconnected and cross-cutting. They're urgent, they're difficult, and that's because they're ultimately going to require transformation of industries, of economies, of societies, and not just incremental change. So they're effectively the what we're collectively trying to achieve at ASI through our work in the aluminium value chain. Those 4 pillars underneath that Anita spoke about, they're the how. So they're how we as ASI, as an organisation, are working to act on these. So through having effective governance, managing a robust program, working to drive change, and reaching beyond certification. So we'll talk a little bit more about these concepts and how they're framing our work at ASI. Next, thanks. So this slide touches on some operational highlights, just to illustrate what these pillars mean in practice. So firstly, under effective governance, this multi-stakeholder consensus building process that we've undertaken for the standards revision, it's a really big achievement. It's really about finding our way through diverse perspectives about performance, about impact, and building common ground across those. The financial resilience that Anita spoke to are shown through our financial results and also our growing team. It's really important. It provides that stable foundation for us to evolve and grow. Under robust program, a real highlight there this year has been that we've achieved full compliance against all 3 ICL codes of good practice. So that's for standard setting, assurance, and impact. And of course, we continue to focus on continual improvement and broader strategies for the integrity of our assurance program. Under driving change, we've invested for a long time in digital program delivery to really maximise our reach. We've done a major update to the ASI website this year. The educational platform for learning we've migrated that across to a new host platform on Tavudi. And with Elemental, we've updated for the new versions of the standards and the assurance manual and launched a public dashboard for that last year as well. We also recognise, beyond the work of our own organisation, the importance of a range of stakeholder sectors, with the financial and investment sector being a key one because of their role in providing capital for the industrial transformations and decarbonisation that needs to happen. So under this driving change piece, we're really working to both directly catalyse change with members and stakeholders, as well as position our work at ASI within broader global action. And finally, under Beyond Certification, the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, or IPAF, is a really critical engagement platform for us. They've been working hard on their contributions into processes like the standards revision, but also further outreach into their community. And so ASI is engaged in a range of community capacity building workshops and projects, which are really important and a way for us to amplify our impact beyond the certification program itself. Next slide, thanks, Thad. So tackling kind of big issues really obviously brings challenges, and these are 3 that I thought would be worth highlighting at an organisational level. As Anita mentioned, and as we may have seen, ASI has been growing strongly since its inception in 2015. So that scaling up challenge is an important one for us, where we need to keep building our capacity for program delivery to a growing membership, while also making sure that we stay joined up as an organisation, we stay agile and make sure we keep focused on and delivering our strategy. As this membership grows, it's of course diversifying, become more heterogeneous. The sizes, locations, supply chain activities, different end use sectors now starting to engage with ASI. We see different organisational cultures, different languages being spoken, of course different priorities and sense of materiality for a given business. And of course regulatory drivers cut across that in different operating locations as well. So all of these provide quite different contexts for uptake of ASI and implementation of ASI standards. So that's an opportunity as well as a challenge for us to keep our arms wrapped around. And finally, on the digital front, something I think all organisations are facing these days, but for ASI, our focus is on integrations across our various platforms, how we can better leverage data for insights and action, and also thinking to other kinds of innovation opportunities, including supporting peer connections. So some important things for us to keep in mind. Next, thanks. So we'll talk a little bit about ASI's key areas of activity, and we've had 3 that we've set out in our strategy. Firstly, the standards revision and rollout. Secondly, we're pretty focused on data and research and growing our efforts in that space. And thirdly, engagement and alignment. And so these are areas where we're trying to focus some energy to continue to support and drive sustainability for aluminium. Next. Great. So our first area of focus has been the standards revision and rollout. And of course, we landed on a big milestone last month with the launch of the new versions of the standards in May 2022. So we've undergone a really extensive process to collate and action more than 1,000 improvement items into the new standards. And this has been the first revision that we've done since we initially launched the whole certification program at the end of 2017. So we're now in the rollout phase with a 1-year transition period, with both standards running alongside, with a view to moving in fully to the 2022 versions within a year. So for 12 months, this 12 months following the launch, members can choose to audit against either the 2017 versions or the new 2022 standards. But from the middle of next year, only the 2022 versions will be eligible to be used for new or recertifying ASI certifications, and we'll be retiring those 2017 versions. If you've got an existing certification against the 2017 standards, that can continue for the full cycle. But of course, we also welcome members that want to step up to the new standards sooner. So effectively in this rollout period, we're shifting the entire portfolio of ASI certifications across to our new standards. And coming up, Chris is going to highlight some of those key changes in the 2022 standards that have come out of this revision process. Next, thanks. So our second area of focus is on data and research. And our goal there is to deepen data insights for members, auditors, ourselves as the Secretariat, and also broader stakeholders. And the outcomes we want to see there is improved knowledge, decision-making, and most importantly, action about sustainability and aluminium. So a few examples of some of our data and research activities. We've done quite a bit of work on chain of custody material flows. Each year we collect ASI chain of custody data from our COC certified entities, and we layer that into a global mass flow model that's been developed by the International Aluminium Institute. We're currently collecting that data for 2021. We already have data for 2019 and 2020. And what that shows us is not only how ASI material flows from bauxite and recycled starting points through the whole value chain, but we can see how that's growing year on year. So we look forward to sharing the new set of data in a couple of months' time. In the greenhouse gas emissions space, we've worked with CRU on their emissions analysis tool to include ASI certification data as another data layer in there. We've also published analyses of greenhouse gas emissions disclosures by ASI certified entities through some independent analysis that we've commissioned. And again, we've got some more work coming in this space. We have an ongoing certification survey that aims to provide insights into the drivers, benefits, and challenges of ASI certification. So if you become certified, you will receive a link to this survey within there, and we encourage you to take some time and share your thoughts with us on these questions. And finally, we've initiated some qualitative research into community and stakeholder perspectives on the bauxite mining sector in Guinea. So we aim to regularly share insights on our data and research activities on these and other work that we're doing. So keep an eye on our website and of course our monthly newsletters for this information. Next slide, thanks. So the third area of focus is around engagement and alignment. We want to be working with members and stakeholders that share our ambitions and priorities. And we want to see improved understanding, improved uptake and recognition, cross-recognition and alignment, and increased value of ASI as an initiative. And by working with others, expanding our collective impact. So a few examples in this space. We've been working with the London Metal Exchange, LME, on their new responsible sourcing requirements that apply not just to aluminium, but to a range of their traded commodities, in fact, all of their traded commodities. We've been undergoing a quite comprehensive alignment assessment of the 2022 performance standard, particularly the criterion around conflict minerals, conflict affected and high risk areas. And our goal there is to become a track A standard for LME and therefore for LME brands to be able to use to demonstrate how they're meeting these responsible sourcing requirements of LME. We've also been working with the Climate Aligned Finance Working Group for Aluminium, part of an initiative in the finance and investment sector to develop methodologies for company-specific and 1.5-degree aligned decarbonisation pathways. And this is really important because we've made some changes in the standard, in the performance standard in the greenhouse gas emissions criteria. So these methodologies will enable, in fact, our members to meet those new criteria. And finally, on the engagement front, we launched last year a new series of monthly webinars called 45 Minutes On, which address a range of key topics, activities, briefings, information from different partners and so on. So that's another one to keep an eye on and an opportunity for us to keep up regular engagement with our members and stakeholders. Next, thanks. So ASI aims to meet members where they are, no matter what their starting point is, and to support everybody's sustainability journey. We aim to drive change and impact within the whole global supply chain. But of course, as ASI's membership grows, we're going to see that diversity of ASI's community continue to increase. What this means is that we will start to attract members that might have a larger initial gap to ASI standards, but it's actually addressing those gaps that's going to be critical for transformative change. So when we bring together this large pool of ASI participation and engagement, we couple that with the capacity building work and a continued focus on integrity in our assurance processes, we hope to bring about a critical mass of stakeholder effort that is working towards positive global change. We ultimately need to be working at scale to be able to catalyse the changes that we're seeking. Next, thanks. Because as we know, we have these really clear sustainability priorities and challenges that are facing us. These are the big issues that we need to tackle. For climate, the aluminium sector must decrease its emissions intensity by 95% by 2050. For circularity, collection rates must get close to 100% for aluminium, but there's also other large-scale waste streams that we need to address and broader resource efficiency issues and efforts needed. Global goals for nature include reversing nature loss by 2030 and full recovery of natural systems by 2050. And of course, protecting and respecting human rights continues to be critical alongside these shifts in the quest for a more just world. So we need to be tackling the inertia in our current systems. And so we all know that we need innovation here, but that's not just in technology, but how we work together as companies, as communities, and as economies. You all, as ASI members, all have really critical roles to play in this. And we aim for ASI to bring together the knowledge, the community, the programs, as well as the broader connections to help drive much needed sustainability transformations for aluminium. Which brings me to my final slide, thank you, where I'd like to share a really big thanks to our wonderful ASI team. We're still, as Anita said, a small organisation. We're 21 people, but we're only small relative to our ambitions. Everyone is bringing diverse skills and contributions to our collective efforts every day. So on behalf of the whole ASI team, I want to thank everyone for being part of this vibrant community of ASI and our shared sustainability journey. And I know we're all really looking forward to working with you all on the practical steps that are still ahead of us. Great. So for our next agenda item in the AGM, we're opening up for discussion now with a panel of ASI board directors. They're going to be turning on their cameras to join us now. And you can direct questions to the board through that Q&A box up on your screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with some initial questions to directors just to get the discussion going. And I'm going to turn to you first, Sasha. The finance and investment sector, as I said, is becoming a bit of focus for ASI. How quickly is the context for sustainable finance changing?
Well, that's a big question, Fiona. I think the context for sustainable finance is evolving quite rapidly. I think I flagged last year that it was moving rapidly. It's moving even more rapidly. So it just keeps evolving. I mean, the biggest kind of issue from an environment, governance, and sustainability perspective for ESG is still climate change. And this year, most financial sector organizations are either setting 1.5 degree aligned net zero pathways and targets, if they haven't already done so. That also include midterm targets, at least 2030, for key sectors, and the aluminium industry is going to be in those key sectors for the financial sector that banks the sector and the rest of the value chain. The focus is really in terms of building all the infrastructure that's needed for the financial sector to address climate change is focused on climate, but it'll pull other issues into focus as well. So it's not kind of everything we're thinking about in terms of standards and pathways is not unique for climate, but it's being built for climate, and other issues will be leveraged and will be focused on as well. This is also mirrored, I guess, in terms of what we're going to see later in the year in the lead up to COP27 in Egypt, in terms of a real strong focus on 2030 targets all over the world. Now, it's much harder for the financial sector to set those pathways and targets without companies, industry groups, or credible standards in those key sectors. So there's a key role for ASI to play in engaging how the finance sector defines sustainable finance for the aluminium industry and the value chain. And linked to that growth, there's significant growth in sustainable finance, be that green finance, transition finance, sustainability linked loans, bonds. Everything is growing rapidly. The demand is huge, and there's just not enough of it. So it just keeps on growing.
Terrific. Thanks, Sasha. And I know it's a massive topic, so I appreciate you trying to distill some highlights there for us. Pippa, if I can turn to you, given the dual nature of both the climate and the nature crisis, what are the challenges do you think for ASI to keep pace with stakeholder expectations that, as Sasha was just saying, are evolving very rapidly?
Thanks, Fiona. I mean, it's an incredibly rapidly changing environment or landscape. And I mean, I believe that all of our companies are under pressure from their stakeholders and regulators on a variety of sustainability issues. And the climate and nature sort of nexus, I guess, are really interdependent. And we need to not only think of mitigation of climate change impacts, but also of resilience and adaptation. So how we think about our activities in this whole space, resolving one issue with another is going to be important. This will vary from geography to geography, but ultimately, we need to aim for the highest levels of responsible performance, regardless of where the demand is coming from. I guess as ASI, we're acutely aware of the changing landscape of policy, and Sasha's alluded to some of this happening in the finance sector. So, but there are also changing expectations from stakeholders of how companies should and need to perform, and how disclosure on these various issues in emerging frameworks coming out of the likes of there's a new one, which is the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures. Some of you will already be familiar with the Task Force for Climate-Based Financial Disclosures. And there's lots of stuff coming out of the World Economic Forum and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development around, net zero commitments and meeting the Paris Agreement, but also around nature positive. So how can these sort of interplay with each other, and how can we use sort of more integrated solutions, I guess, to deal with some of these kind of common problems, or at least areas where they overlap. So really it's up to us to kind of understand what the issues are, but also how to help the membership of ASI to respond to them. So I think ASI has a duty to recognize that sustainable development and responsible performance through the value chains is dependent on responding to this emerging complexity, and I guess keep making sure that we have an integrated approach, that the standards talk to each other, and in the evolution as we move forward with them, there will be work for the Standards Committee. So brilliant work that they've already done, and it's fantastic. We have a wonderful new set of standards that are as up to date as we can possibly keep them. But this is work that's going to constantly need to be revisited. This will interface with water security and social performance and human rights and social equity. All of these things are really part of the same story. So at ASI, we need to make every effort to keep up with these changes. The teams in the Secretariat are aware of these demands, and that our standards and principles, as I say, will be they've kept abreast as much as possible. But we have to make sure that we're just keeping tabs of this. But I also reflect back to the kind of full membership, actually, to all of you on the call, but the full membership, to kind of contribute to this too. What are you experiencing? How does this become part of your reality? what are you as companies doing to actually sort of interface with this climate nature nexus, and how can you help us to make sure that we're future proofed? So yes, we've what are your companies doing to contribute to commitments to nature and climate? So moving space, but actually I'm really excited about it because it makes us I think very much part of the sort of leading edge of the influence and the impact that ASI is having. So thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Pippa. That was great. Jan, if I might turn to you, if you take a moment to unmute, perfect. So not all ASI members are familiar with the ASI board's work and with the ASI board's role, rather. How would you describe it as an board member for some time?
Thank you, Fiona. Let me try and explain it. There was a time when boards were a group of old grey-haired men who drank whiskey and smoked cigars and left the decision-making to the executive director of the organization. I'm also afraid for Fiona that those days are over. The ASI board is actually quite a hard-working group. It's a diverse group. It's our experienced professionals elected from all member groups of ASI. The board has the fiduciary role with regard to the interests of all ASI members, but also bearing in mind the interests of all external stakeholders. So we look at the total situation. The board ensures that the organization is doing the right things, as was already mentioned before, specified mission and strategy, etc. But it also looks if the organization is doing the things right. Operational monitoring, risk management, financial performance, etc., etc. Note that we do not do the standards. It was already mentioned, that's done by the standards committee. We only approve formally the final outcome of that discussion. So if we look at the roles of the board, 3 roles. The board has a statutory role, which means approving strategy, budgets, annual reports, interaction with the external auditors, and also ensuring the continuity of the organization. The board has an advisory role, a sounding board for the CEO, giving solicited and unsolicited advice. And thirdly, but not lastly, the board has an HR role. We're the boss of Fiona, the boss of the CEO, one could say that. The board has 2 subcommittees. They were mentioned already before. Finance and audit is one subcommittee and the other one is governance. These committees prepare the subsequent board meetings, and the board meets about every 2 to 3 months or so. So I have very much enjoyed my time in the ASI board, and unfortunately I will have to enjoy my whiskey and cigars somewhere else.
Thank you, Jan. That was quite an evocative image. So Alexi, I might turn to you next. What's been a highlight of the ASI board's work in your first year as a director?
Thank you, Fiona. So first of all, I would like to tell that this is the first time when I'm acting as a director of ASI board. Previously, I was a member of the ASI Standard Committee and a member of various ASI working groups, and actively participated in the ASI standards revision process. But at the moment, the director's role is an absolutely different role. The main focus is on strategy of the organization, as well as on risks and opportunities related to the organization activities now and in the future, all based on the dynamic change of the external environment. As it was mentioned before, when Anita and you, Fiona, presentation, an important task in 2021 was to update the ISI strategy for 2030. It was a highly interesting and important teamwork to assess the risks, to construct a SWOT analysis, to generate ideas for the next 10 years, all based on the current situation and future forecasts. As a part of ISI Finance and Audit Committee, we generated a roadmap for long-term financial projection for ISI and considered not only increasing membership, but also the necessary resources that support and ensure effective operations. All of this was approved by the board last year. And of course, I would like to mention again that the multi-year story of ISI standards revision process was successfully finalized, and the new version of the standards and supporting documents have been approved in May of 2022 as planned, and it can be found at the website of ASI. I would like to share my warm regards to and thanks to entire ASI team, to all ASI directors for the hard work. I think the ASI directors will leave us this year and welcome the new directors who join the board this year. And I'm sure that we will make a great progress together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alexei. And Rosa, turning to you, you're a new director, your term's just started. What's drawn you to serve on the board?
Thank you, Fiona. Actually, for me personally and for ALCO as an organization, ASI is a very important initiative. I do believe it is critical for the aluminum industry. So we are very thankful that a group of visionary people got together a few years ago to build a multi-stakeholder approach to defining what sustainability means for the aluminum industry. So as a result of this work that has been happening for a number of years today, we are in a position that makes our industry stronger, just because we have a reference that has been built with inputs from different stakeholders representing the critical parts and pieces of the society, the industry, the users, the transformers, and everybody else. And we have brought the best of our knowledge from all these different backgrounds together to find a consensus on what sustainability means for our industry. So I can just not imagine how hard it would be for individual companies to define this path on their own. It could be impossible, and it couldn't have the trust and the support and the independence that it has, this initiative. So based on that, I think it is a very I could say, important objective to dedicate my time to it and for ALCO to dedicate resources to it. So this is a very important and I would say the most important reason for me to be present here and to use part of my time to serve on this board. Then the other reason is related to the fact that I served in the standards committee before. So I had the opportunity to learn from very different people and very different backgrounds and very different stakeholders on how they see our industry from their perspective and what are the key challenges they want to address. So the knowledge on this process and these points of view, I think that could be helpful also for the board going forward. And Alexei was also part of the standard setting committee, so probably we are on the same page there. But if I had to be totally honest, there is another third reason that is quite selfish on my side, but it's very real, and is that I'm very honored to be part of this team. So to continue engaging with the same set of stakeholders and to be part of a board with 7 other very smart and educated, trained, knowledgeable, experienced people, again from different backgrounds, that will teach me a lot. So that's the personal and selfish reason. But I hope that in the next couple of years, I will be able to contribute to this board with the experience I have in governance, with the experience I have in the industry, and continue supporting and advancing for a future where we know that this is going to be even more important. So very pleased to be part of this and very honored to have been given this responsibility by the membership.
Thanks very much, Rosa. So we've had a question about the recognition of ASI as a Track A option by LME. The person says it's a big positive, and given the exponential growth in ESG standards, rating systems, and so on, how do we ensure that ASI is always in the mix when aluminium is under consideration in the development of these new standards? So I'll touch on that, and if anyone wants to add to it, welcome. So obviously this is a big focus for us. That whole engagement and alignment piece is looking at that. LME was just one example, but we're working with a range of programs, whether it's green building schemes, things like EcoVadis, a range of other initiatives, whether they are about formal recognition or just looking at how we kind of align and stay in track of or incorporate sort of new requirements that might be in other place, or think about how our program can serve the needs of others as a kind of input. So that's a big piece of work we do need to prioritise. If you have access to Elemental, we keep a log of other standards and schemes and what current status of activity is in there if you want to have a look, or by all means get in touch and we're happy to share that with you. There was a parallel question about other discussions going on to merge ASI and EcoVadis. Not to my knowledge, quite different sorts of programs, but certainly it's something that they're a program that we're engaging with in terms of their recognition of the work that we do. I've got a question here, Anita, perhaps for you, which is, what's the board's view on the role of ASI in a geopolitical context? For example, the consequence of mandatory and voluntary sanctions adopted by governments as a result of the situation in Ukraine. I just need to unmute.
So just let me, yep. Thanks, Fiona. Probably expected a question somewhere around this on this subject. So thank you to whoever asked that. So perhaps if I could start with that specifically on Ukraine, I think sort of as from a personal perspective, I would like to just say, express some deep concern about the military and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I say that from a personal perspective and also as the chair of ASI. So I just sort of put that before I even sort of talk to that question, and thank the person for raising the subject, because I think it's always front and centre in these discussions that it's on a number of people's minds. So it's good that we've surfaced it early in the discussion. In terms of Ukraine itself, I'll talk about a little bit of the history of what we've been doing at ASI. Fiona and I have been keeping a close watch on this since it started, and keeping in close contact. I think it's fair to say that most of the sanctions that have been imposed by various governments have been economic sanctions. They haven't actually been on individual companies or on they've been on individuals, but not on companies. I think we need to step back a little when we start thinking about this and thinking about the purpose of ASI. ASI is an organisation that's focused on sustainability, and we look at sustainability actions related to the actions of our members, not foreign affairs. And so for me, it's always been, when I've been considering this, I've looked back to the wonderful governance documents that this organisation has. We have a constitution, we have our governance handbook, and I've looked to those, and then I've asked the question, is there a member breaching our constitution? Is there a member breaching their certification? Is that something that we need to be looking at? Because it's not our role to get involved in geopolitics. Our role is to look at our certification systems, to look at our membership and what they're doing, and are they fulfilling the requirements that we're imposing with our standards? And that's what we've been doing. Now, to this point, there's been, to the best of our knowledge, there's been no breach that we're aware of. And so we've been keeping that watching brief. If any of the sanctions by governments had have been imposed that would have bound ASI, of course, we would have complied immediately, but that's not the case. That's not been what's occurred. So we've kept that watching brief. I think the other statement, or the other comment I would make too here is we have independent directors on our board. And I'm not sure that Jan mentioned that as well when he was talking about the directors. We have two independent directors, Sasha and myself. And interestingly enough, or one of the things that I did, as I'm one of them, during the course of this, the independent directors and the non-commercial directors did actually meet separately from the board to have a discussion about this issue, so that we were discussing it with what I would call the non-commercial directors, the independents and the non-commercials, so that we took it outside, if you like, that commercial environment of ASI. So I'll probably leave it there. Happy to take any other questions if there are any, but I think that probably covers the key points that I would make at this point on that.
Great, thanks, Anita. So there's a question from Catherine about the work on the 1.5 degree pathway. So that's under the Climate Aligned Finance Working Group on Aluminium. And the question is, will it be overseen or overlooked by the Standards Committee? So that working group, Chris is participating in that, so I can probably touch on that a little bit more in his section. But it's being convened by the Rocky Mountain Institute, involves ASI, IAI, a number of other stakeholder groups and expertise, as well as key banking organisations. So I'm sure Chris will be keeping in touch with that kind of stakeholder process into our stakeholder process. And that's another great example of the complexity of the landscape in which we're working, where there's consensus building processes happening in multiple places and everybody's kind of looking at alignment. The nice thing about this working group is that it should be the one place where agreement can be reached on this really important issue, fingers crossed. So I have a question. I might come back to you, Pippa. I know we've got the Convention on Biological Diversity happening later this year. It's a bit like a COP in many ways. What are the key agreements, do you think, that are being sought in that forum?
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I mean, it's anyone's agenda at the moment, and it's great that it's finally we've settled on a venue so that the discussions can actually move forward to developing a target. At the moment, we're looking at the kind of 2030 target for nature, which is really about reversing the decline in nature and how companies, and there's certainly going to be elements around the role that the private sector needs to play in helping to deliver that. So the expectation will be, you know, as we've reflected in the standards, and one of the core pillars of ASI is around nature positive. That's going to be very clear there, but also what the there'll be a sort of taxonomy that'll come out and what that means. There'll be some guidance on, you know, what is expected from companies. And what we're trying to do is to, I guess, find ways that we can nest the kind of international target, that kind of this big biodiversity framework, the post-2020, well, the 2030 framework, into the future too, because you know, what we have is a trajectory to try and recover nature by 2050. So it's the steps that will then be reflected down to national jurisdictions, what countries need to do in terms of their national biodiversity strategies, the role that nature plays in their economies. We've seen a kind of a move towards the bioeconomy, nature economies, where this is not really about using nature as a natural resource. It's about making sure that we are building resilience and recovery and restoration in our ecosystems. So I'm very excited actually by the role. There's a huge increase in the number of companies that are involved in the dialogue. You know, it's a very active space. So Business for Nature are there, the World Economic Forum's there, WBCSD, and 101 others. So yeah, certainly as an organization that I'm part of, FFI is going to be present, but you know, we'll be working with collaborations, and the need for cross-sectoral collaboration between the private sector, the civil society, and government is going to be a huge theme, I think, that's going to come to the fore. So watch that space, yeah.
Great, thanks, Pippa. And I might build on one of the questions that came through, Sasha, to you, you know, about how ASI engages with this complexity from within a banking environment, dealing with, you know, every kind of investable kind of thing out there. How do you find kind of keeping on top of this sort of landscape and looking at how different sorts of programs can support, you know, the work of sustainable finance, for example?
Yeah, keeping on top of it is a challenge. There's always more things going on, but there are frameworks that are being developed that will aim to harmonize approaches and standards, and we're seeing that a lot at the moment. So I mean, Pippa already mentioned the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. Now that's releasing kind of draft frameworks, kind of a number of them throughout this year, so people can take a look at it as it builds and evolves. They didn't really want to wait to put the whole thing out, but that's an example of something that's evolving as we speak. And then there are different national and regional bodies that are being brought together to input into those discussions now in the earlier stages, which is exciting to see. That, I mean, really, and there's taxonomies in various parts of the world. There's an EU taxonomy. There's one that's being developed in Australia as well. There's a number of those and everybody tries to build off each other a little bit so that we're not starting from scratch, and there is an alignment from an international kind of harmonized approach as much as possible. So there are those efforts, and I think there's such an important role for ASI to play in those discussions. Nobody wants to reinvent the wheel, and for any individual financial sector institution or even groups of finance sector organizations, it's a bit of a chicken and egg in terms of how you set the standards, because you want to set standards that are credible, legitimate, and possible for industry to meet, but they also need to align to timeframes that keep us within 1.5 degrees. So the more harmonization and alignment and credible standards that are out there for the key sectors, the easier it will be. So we're starting to move into a phase of harmonization, and ASI is playing a key role in those discussions, and we'll have a lot more work to do on that in the near future.
Indeed, that's terrific. Thank you, Sasha. There was a question just about, I think, asking me to repeat ASI targets for each pillar, but what I will do, they're not so much specific targets, but the kinds of things that are well articulated in terms of the broader challenges that we need to address. I'll make sure we include that in the debrief minutes and also in the newsletter comms that we do of the thing. So we might close the board panel. So I really appreciate everyone's contributions, and move now to the next agenda item, which is Chris, I'm going to hand over to, who is going to discuss some of those key changes in the ASI standards. There might be some interesting standards questions coming through, and I encourage you, I don't know if a few people put their hands up, but the way that we can answer questions is if you pop them in that Q&A box, type them in. We look forward to those. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Hello, everyone. As Fiona says, ask questions away. I think we've got about half an hour for this section, 10 minutes for me, and then some Q&A. Next slide, please, Thad. As mentioned, this is the outcome of a 3-year standards revision process. I'd like to reiterate or give my thanks to the Standards Committee. There are many people who had input to the development process, in particular the ASI team, and my predecessor, Krista West, who led the revision process through his first 2 years. It's part of our ISEAL code compliance requirement that we update our standards at least every 5 years, our normative documents, but also underlying guidance. And what we're going to see in the future is actually more frequent updates to the guidance to target specific audiences, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Maybe to touch on some of we heard that we had 1,000 changes across the revision process, which incorporated 2 public consultation periods as well. Maybe talk about some of the broad general changes in the performance standard, and then dive down a little bit into specific criteria. In general, I think one of the biggest changes under the performance standard is this move for the performance standard to apply to industrial user class members in its entirety within a phased approach. So currently, for those folks who are downstream using aluminium products, there's only a requirement to gain assurance against Principle 4, material stewardship. But in the future, under this version 3, eventually those certifying entities will need to be against all the principles. So that's a real kind of move to reflect the fact that we are full value chain initiative. It also recognizes the role of those players on things like greenhouse gas emissions reduction as well. And I'll talk a bit about that specifically in a moment. You heard from the board this push towards transparency and public disclosure out there in the ether. We've reflected that throughout the standard. There's expanded requirements for transparency, public disclosure across many of the criteria within all of the principles. As a reflection, I think of a bit of a discussion that went on about ASI being an in-gatherer of information, a kind of a data collection organization. The feeling was that might meet some specific purposes, but really what's required is transparency, public disclosure against recognized harmonized metrics. So you'll find that throughout this standard. One thing that we have to cope with, of course, is Fiona mentioned this earlier, this heterogeneity of membership. And one thing we do see is increasing certified entities from small and medium enterprises, specifically on the downstream. So the requirements for transparency, public disclosure are, I hope, kind of loose enough to enable different sized entities to reflect the materiality of issues in their public disclosure. But that's not to say that people are abrogated of their responsibility. Those criteria apply to all. We find a strengthening of the gender lens throughout the standard, not just in the update to criterion 9.2, women's equity and empowerment, but woven throughout the standard. And in fact, that's true not just of the gender lens, but also of affected populations and organizations, including Indigenous people. So not relegated to individual criteria, but actually woven through the criteria as a whole. We see harmonized frequency and explicit triggers for review of policies and plans. And this is a kind of a reflection of maybe some of the discussions that went on within the standards committee. Is what kind of language does one put into the normative documents, the criterion language, and what's best left in the guidance? And we, on the one hand, hear lots of people say we need clarity, so we need the criteria to be very specific. We want more language in there. On the other, we hear those criteria need to apply to various different shaped entities. What we've done here is to bring in triggers for review of policies and plans actually into the criteria language. So you will find that throughout the document, so that policies, plans, the systems that companies implement can adapt, can change to this changing sustainability environment. It's not a case of waiting till the next certification or waiting until the next standards revision in 2027. It's about response to issues changing on the ground. Next slide, please. More specifically, we've seen expanded requirements for impact assessments on the criteria 2.5, 2.6. We heard it earlier, the greenhouse gas criteria under Principle 5 significantly revised. You may remember under version 2, we have an 8 tons per ton threshold for smelting that includes scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. That's been expanded to include upstream scope 3 emissions, with the threshold set at 11 tons per ton. But really the interesting piece, I think, is this second one, this need for all certifying entities to have 1.5 degrees C aligned emission pathways and plans with interim targets accordingly. And that, of course, is required by all. That's not just for smelters, it's not just for upstream, but as industrial users start to certify against the standard in its entirety, they themselves will need to have pathways and plans which incorporate procurement approaches for decarbonisation. One thing that's missing currently, of course, though, is a way to develop those entity-specific 1.5 degree pathways that was being talked about earlier on, the kind of work that we're involved in now. The feeling was in the standards committee, and I think among the stakeholders as a whole, that there isn't the time to wait to incorporate a 1.5 degree element into the standard. We can't wait till 2027 on the next revision. So incorporation of that requirement into the standard today, and we work as quickly as possible to develop those entity level 1.5 degree ways of coming up with a pathway. There is some material out there, happy to talk about that later or afterwards as well. Public disclosure very specifically on energy and emissions with independent verification. So this is somewhere that we're very explicit on what the requirements related to public disclosure that includes third-party verification. Inclusion of area of influence, specifically under discharges and emissions, but throughout the standard. This inclusion of ecosystem services, so what Pippa was talking about earlier, not just a focus on biodiversity, but the services that the systems bring to human populations, to environmental, to ecosystems as well. That's been incorporated into the standard very specifically, Principle 8, where we also have a new requirement on protected areas, a need for identification of protected areas within areas of influence, management plan development, and no mining or exploration in protected areas, apart from under some very specific exceptional circumstances. Talked already about the LME responsible sourcing requirements, very clearly articulated in both the standard criteria and the guidance. Strengthen criterion on violence and harassment under Principle 10 points, criterion 10.6, and a strengthened Principle 11, occupational health and safety, to align with the newer requirements of ISO 45001. We've expanded free, prior and informed consent under some specific criteria, but that again is woven throughout the standard as well and in the guidance, and is some work that we'll be doing following this release, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. Next slide, please. So with all those changes to the performance standard, that's a lot to take in. We've had a lot of questions about the differences between the older standards and the new standards. They have been input into elementals. So if you were to go in now and do a self-assessment, you can do that against version 3, as well as your existing version 2. But in addition, we have a number of training materials available as well. And so I encourage you to go and look at our new educational platform, which is within Tabuti, which includes specific training, specific guidance for certifying entities, as well as for auditors, and includes some broader material as well. So the website is on there. We'll be updating that very regularly as well. Next slide, please. Chain of custody. We've actually done a fair amount on chain of custody. It's an area, it's a standard, I guess, which people are maybe less familiar with than the performance standard. But as Fiona was saying, we do see the flow of chain of custody material through the system growing every year. And so people are certifying against COC, they are marketing COC material, and it is moving through the value chain. In this round, we've seen improved consistency in language and defined terms. You'll see talk of inputs and outputs versus inflows and outflows. We've been much more specific in the language we're using, really try and narrow down the terms and the definitions accordingly. We've simplified COC material types. We've got rid of liquid metal and cold metal. They both become incorporated under ASI Aluminium. And we've removed reference to internal scrap remelting, which is a bit of a, in the COC, it doesn't really exist because it doesn't leave an entity scope. If it leaves the entity certification scope, it no longer is internal scrap. So COC doesn't see internal scrap loops. And so we were encouraged by many people to remove that from the system, and we have done that. The market credit system was eliminated relatively early on in the revision process. We've revised our reporting requirements under section 1.7. Thank you very much to those entities that are reporting 1.7 data. We're collecting that as we speak, as Fiona mentioned, and should have some results within the next 4 to 6 weeks. Improved guidance for outsourcing contractors. Expansion of sections 3 to 7, which is eligible inputs to chain of custody, to include material sourced from traders. This was a clear message we had from entities and companies all the way along the value chain to somehow incorporate the role of traders into COC. So that's been clearly articulated. I won't go into that in detail, but it does allow COC material to flow through the system with traders playing a role. Eligible scrap has been expanded to include closed loop recycling, part of that circularity discussion that was being talked about earlier. We've simplified material accounting system guidance, and we've included recyclable scrap material in there as well. One of the other pieces is on, I guess, on transparency, and less on transparency of entities as scoped, but transparency of information as it flows along the value chain or supply chain, as it flows with chain of custody material. We've included recycled content as optional sustainability data within chain of custody documents, as well as the opportunity for entities to include carbon footprint data. So to understand scope 1, scope 2, upstream scope 3 emissions of shipped material as it moves through the system. Next slide, please. So, the standards released, guidance accompanying it. We have the educational platform for training as well. What are we now looking forward to do next? Well, one of the things we're definitely going to be doing is to have regular scheduled updates of supporting material, including guidance. So what you will see are regular updates to guidance across both of the standards, and not waiting till 2027. And that's a reflection of, on the one hand, what we're learning from certifying entities and this heterogeneity of certifying entities, the kind of guidance that they need to respond much more quickly to that, but also to respond to external influences as well, the role of financial institutions, what auditors need in order to do good audit. So you will see much more regular updates to guidance and much more tailored guidance for certain audiences. We're dynamically responding to changing sustainability landscape and implementation experience, as I say. And we're looking to have ongoing consultation. So instead of limiting ourselves to public consultation within defined 60 or 90-day, 30-day consultation periods, is to have an ongoing ability to gather the kind of thousands of changes that people might like to see in our standards, to focus those on the guidance first of all, but also to look forward to the next revision period in 2027 or sooner, and how we can update criteria as well. And there I'd really like to stress one point, which is that there has been agreement by the Standards Committee, and that's reflected back from the board as well, that there is the potential for changes to criteria prior to 2027 for critical issues. So as we see the outcome of the biodiversity discussions later this year, as we see 1.5 degree pathways for entities being developed, there is the opportunity, albeit we understand the difficulties of including that in revised criteria before we come to the next revision period. All that overseen, I must say, to Catherine's point earlier on, by the Standards Committee. So while the Standards Committee themselves won't necessarily be developing 1.5 degree pathways for entities, the incorporation of those approaches, those methods, into the standard will be overseen by the Standards Committee, who ultimately have sign-off on any changes. Key issues for discussion, they really align with the ASI strategy. So for climate change, it's entity-level methods for greenhouse gas pathways development. So same before, including the allocation of greenhouse gas emissions with according to SCRAP, Scope 3 data, availability, quality of Scope 3 data, and Scope 2 accounting methodologies as well. Under biodiversity, as was mentioned in the board panel earlier on, our response to Kunming later this year. Our 1.5 degree approach for greenhouse gas emissions was actually articulated by the Standards Committee before we came up with revised criteria. And I expect we will see that kind of approach come through on biodiversity ecosystem services as well. Human rights, the mapping of affected populations, further guidance for free, prior and informed consent, not necessarily well understood by entities and by auditors likewise, and baseline socioeconomic impact studies as well. On circularity, not just a focus on recycling, but also design for recycling, design for reuse, that potential for traceability models to complement our current mass balance approach. Looking forward to that next revision period. And finally, a focus on impacts. So moving beyond or to complement existing systemic management system approaches to actually include baseline articulations, measurable criteria for performance as well. These are all issues for discussion by the Standards Committee and more broadly in the next phase. I'll leave it there for questions. I've taken too much time as it is, so let me see.
That was great, Chris. So I think there's a question here around communication, awareness, education for ASI COC material. I can put in a plug for an excellent lemon-based 45 minutes on session that Chris did explaining COC and how system boundaries work. And we have tried to feature it a little bit more in our website as well, but we'll certainly take that as something that we can work on. Chris, did you want to speak to this? Because I don't know that it's always like consumer facing, is it? And I know you've been thinking about this kind of claims piece and different sector needs and stuff.
Absolutely. So, you know, it isn't just about that final on-product claim, right? That final on-product claim is relatively limited, personally, I think, to certain packaging segments, right? It's not necessarily what everyone wants. So as we look at chain of custody and how the material flows through the system, is to understand what kind of claims folks want to make and how best to answer those claims, to put the systems in place that enable people to do that. We are not there to define let's say a market for chain of custody material, but there's a role for people further down the value chain to start asking for it, right? You know, we have an ability to give ASI NES this COC material claim. It's getting ready because the upstream industry, 15% of bauxite mining, 15% of alumina refining and smelting are getting ready by supplying it. What we're not yet seeing are folks further downstream, industrial users and others, explicitly asking for COC material. I think it's coming, and I think it's coming in certain market segments. So I think we need to be ready for that, not designing a standard that tries to do one thing for everyone, but is much more tailored on the different needs of different segments, different industrial user types, and even those midstream as well. It's a comms job, and also, you know, the chain of custody stuff is kind of not easy to understand. It is kind of complex, and we need to be able to articulate it in ways that simple marketing folk can understand. So that is a job for us, but it's also a job for our members as well. So we want to hear, what do you need? What do you need from this in order for us to let this COC material do its job and flow through the system?
That's great, Chris. We've got another question about training, and particularly around the performance standards, COC standards, the new versions, and in other languages. There's questions about Chinese, whether in China or online. We're doing work around translations. Yeah, did you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. There's document translations ongoing. You'll see those flow through the system as well. In the training materials that are kind of they're on the Tavuti site, you'll also see transcripts as well. So increased accessibility is certainly what we're looking to approach this with, and not just, I think that early days is about getting the material translated. But it's not just about translation, it's about interpretation. How do we build guidance that is useful for certain audiences, and not just online audiences? You know, if we're engaging indigenous populations and remote communities in some of these discussions, we've got to be thinking about how we tailor our guidance and our training to meet their needs. So yes, Chinese is available. You can find it on Tavuti now. Many of our systems have Chinese translation. Next step, interpretation. And for that, I think we need good feedback for the membership too, right? What works for you, what doesn't? I think we shouldn't be spending lots of money and our time doing lots of these things if they're not being used by you, the members. So tell us what you need.
Excellent. So we did have that earlier question from Catherine around the Climate Aligned Finance Working Group, the work on the 1.5 degree, that company, the entity level pathways. Did you want to talk a little bit more about what's going on in that working group, timeframes, etc.?
Yes, so it's to kind of reiterate that the Standards Committee itself, as written in the criterion, it's the wording is an ASI endorsed methodology for 1.5, if and when available. And it's the Standards Committee's job to endorse that approach when it comes, not necessarily to develop it. And I think we were looking for partnerships with other organizations to be able to develop those kind of pathways. International Aluminium Institute for the broad sectoral view that flows down from the International Energy Agency, a global economy-wide view, but also others who are developing systems like science-based targets. And the issue, we heard it earlier on, that there's capacity issues. Everyone wants this information. Everyone wants these pathways. And I'm afraid to say aluminium kind of comes down the list. You know, if you're steel or chemicals or one of these other ones, you're in first, and aluminium comes much later on. So actually the finance folks came in quicker. I have to say, than some of those other more sectoral based approaches. So the climate aligned finance is one of the folks we're talking to, and development of a pathway. You know, I know I've said before late 2022, I think we're now looking at more like 2023, but in that next kind of year to 18-month period. And our focus, I have to say, is on harmonization. So what we don't want is for climate aligned finance to go in one direction, science-based targets to suddenly go off in a different direction. It all needs to flow down from that IEA, aluminium sectoral, and then entity specific too. So the climate aligned finance work, the working group is moving the quickest. So we're in there, but we're not just in there, we're also in other places to ensure harmonization, talking to those partners. And look, you said it, Fiona, it's kind of not difficult. It's difficult. It's 95% emissions reduction, right? The direction is very clear. The smelters have to fully decarbonize power by mid-century, and there's a relatively clear pathway to do that. Some of the challenges, actually, I have to say, happen probably more in the downstream than in the upstream, where the biggest reductions have to be made and the direction is the clearest. So I think some of the more challenging discussions over the next year or so will be on how do we treat scrap? How do we treat those different inflows as well? And the burden of responsibility of the different entities too, especially as you mentioned earlier, we have a very heterogeneous membership, and the entities are very differently scoped. So we're also doing some internal work now, looking to build databases or data set of public disclosure and its associated scope. So if you go out now to, let's say, CRU, you can get process level emissions. And if you go to individual companies, you'll find, let's say, targets writ large. What you don't necessarily see is how they are differentially scoped. And that's the kind of work we want to do now to ensure that any criteria or guidance change is applicable to those different shaped entities at different points along the value chain.
Yeah, excellent. So one of the changes I think you might have touched on, but certainly in the greenhouse gas emissions criteria, is that we've changed from talking about that process level footprint, so smelter emissions, to mine to metal. Do you want to talk a little bit about the thinking there and where the pull and push for that is?
Yes, so I think it's coming to that value chain approach, right? Yeah. I mean, very late on in the discussions, I think I could be open about this, there was a question of, well, why, you know, as well as having this production base, couldn't we have a threshold for consumption based? Now, to some extent, that's articulating the 1.5 degree pathway. In order for industrial users to meet the pathway, they will need to procure low carbon. But first of all, you need to understand what that low carbon really means. And that 8 tons per ton scope 1 and 2 for smelters is really only a partial carbon footprint of the material itself. And actually, if you look across life cycle analyses around the world, we want to be incorporating those other elements. It's not just about your power and your direct emissions from the smelting process. It's also the alumina refining processes and transportation upstream as well. And those processes will also have to be reduced 70, 80, 90% by mid-century. It's not just about decarbonize your power and everything's done. So the thinking was, at least at this stage, is to turn that smelter number, scope 1 and scope 2, into something that is truly representative of the upstream emissions as well. One of the other things is that not all smelters look the same, right? Some smelters are producing their own anodes, some are buying anodes, and there that scoping issue comes into play. If you're producing anodes, it's in your scope 1. If you're buying them, it's a scope 3. So this is also about benchmarking. It's about having a common line. And I'll be honest with you, the 11 tons per ton really is 8 tons per ton plus the upstream element as well. I'm not going into detail here, but it's not just about yes, no, 11 tons. There is the ability for you to emit more than 11 tons for certain operations in the baseline year, but you need to be meeting targets to be reducing that to 2030 and beyond. I think that's a big focus of the discussion that's been happening over the last 2 or 3 years, is where you are today is interesting and people are making different claims based on that, but the transformational change that is required is about the future. And even those lowest emitting today will need to reduce down their emissions by 75% mid-century in order to meet 1.5 degree goals. So it's everyone who will have to move transformationally over the next 30 years. And that's what we want our standard to do, right? That's what we want ASI's implementation to achieve.
Excellent. Yes, some big challenges indeed. So we've got a question about standards training face-to-face, perhaps in the China context, but more generally, but it might be a good opportunity to note that we're in discussion with COU about their annual Aluminium conference. It's usually in May, and we're looking to co-host that with them, also with IAI. So we hope to be able to kind of put in some training, workshop sort of pieces within that as well. So that's something to look ahead to, May 2023. Obviously, people might be interested before then. So certainly trainings in China is something that we look to explore with partners. Travel is a little bit difficult, but we also are ready. If you have questions about the standards, just get in touch with us, either through the Elemental Help Desk or through our website, etc. We answer questions all the time, so we're perfectly ready to do that. Maybe time for one last question, which was, Chris, how and to which extent has the perspective of auditors and auditability of criteria been considered in the standards revision process?
Well, it's been requested as part of that kind of public consultation, and it was in gathering of information through Elemental that happened as well. And I know there's kind of questions around, on the one hand, auditability of the standard, but also on the ability of auditors to fully grasp what it is we're asking for, right? On the one hand, you have the auditable standards. On the other, you need auditors who are well trained and competent in order to do that. And so there is two parts to that. I have to say, in the public consultation, the consultation process, the feedback from auditors was relatively limited. And you do find when you go through a specific audit, there's some auditor feedback, but then there's a step away. I do know, and I understand, Winfried, we've had these discussions before as well, that there are challenges associated with the auditability of some of those criteria. And that's why we want to work on guidance from day one. So I'm not waiting to 2027 for update of guidance. Now it's about having guidance that's tailored for auditors that allows them to collect subjective evidence against the criteria as well. But there is a job to be done on competence of auditors. That's part of our training scheme. And also, I think we have to be we have to know that the demands on auditors are going to increase. We're not the only certification scheme out there. Auditors will be in demand around the world to do different audits. And so auditor capacity, having the auditor capacity and competence and the quality is something that we're going to have to work on over the next few years as well.
Great. Just one last auditor relevant question, which is about, has there been a review of the approved auditors for the new standards? Well, what we do is that we roll out new mandatory training for those auditors that they need to meet by a certain time frame. I think it might be September or certainly before their first audit against the new standards. And so the list that we have of approved auditors in Elemental and on the website is up to date, and people will get weeded out basically if they don't keep track with this ongoing learning that we require as the standards get updated. Yeah. Great. Well, we might start to wrap that up. Chris, awesome presentation. Thank you very much. And also for all your work and with the Standards Committee to roll out this big milestone for ASI and the ongoing work, of course, to support that implementation. So thank you. As we said, happy to take questions outside of the AGM as well at any time. It informs the kind of data gathering that Chris spoke to in terms of those guidance updates where we see this kind of lack of clarity, lack of understanding. What this in-gathering that Chris spoke to is really critical for this stage of you know, the ongoing direction of the ASI program. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Anita as the chair of the meeting and chair of the board to close us out. Thanks, Anita.
Thanks, Fiona. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. And also thank you to everyone for the discussion, the lively participation, and for participating in our panel and the Q&A with Chris. I hope you enjoyed the format and found it informative. We'd love to hear your feedback on that. We're always looking for ideas for how to do these AGMs to make them interesting. So please do give us your feedback. But I hope you've also heard about the leadership role that we are playing at ASI in placing the aluminium sector at the forefront of climate change and sustainability debate. And I think, Chris, thank you again to the Standards Committee for all the work that you've done during the year. But please don't hesitate to contact the Secretariat Have a look at our updated website. I'm not quite sure anyone mentioned that during the course of today, but we have updated the website. The Secretariat's done a fabulous job with that. And also our 45 minutes on has been mentioned a couple of times. If you haven't listened to that, highly recommend you go and have a listen. It is 45 minutes and there's a number of very interesting sessions on the website. So please do that. Thanks again to Fiona and her team for all the work in putting this together and just their work throughout the year, and also to my fellow directors for their participation and commitment to ASI. That's the end of our formal business for today. Once again, thank you all very much for attending, and so I can formally close the meeting and declare the 2021 AGM closed. Thanks very much and have a good day.